Good evening. So I'm Hania Salah, Director of the Columbia Global Center in Amman. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our last public event before the holidays. Of course, we'll resume our speaker series programming early in the new year and hope to see you then again. This evening's speaker, Nadim Bawalsa, is a historian of modern Palestine and the author of a new book, Transnational Palestine, Migration and the Right of Return Before 1948, published by Stanford University Press. Of course, 1948 is a date we all know too well and have heard testimonials and stories about it that have been passed down from one generation to the next. It is also a date that has occupied headlines this past week with the release on Netflix of the film Farha, directed by Darren Salam, and all the failed campaigns to revoke it. But Nadim's work focuses on an earlier period in Palestinian history, which may not be as well known. Transnational Palestine is the first book to chart the history of Palestinian immigration to Latin America, beginning in the late 19th century. It explores the struggles Palestinian migrants faced to secure Palestinian citizenship in the interwar period, as well as the ways in which these challenges contributed to the formation of a diaspora and the emergence of Palestinian national consciousness. Using previously unexamined primary source documents from archives in Jerusalem, London, and Santiago, Nadim shows how British authorities deliberately denied thousands of Palestinian migrants the right to return, and how they mobilized across the diaspora and drafted thousands of petitions and newspaper articles to protest the injustice. He argues that the Palestinian struggle to return emerged well before 1948. Nadim poses the question, what does this mean for Palestinians' collective consciousness and the way they comprehend the history of their dispossession and exile, whether a century ago, in 1948, 1967, or today? Is the right of return still worth fighting for? A few more words about Nadim before I turn it over to him. He is the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. He has published in journals including the Jerusalem Quarterly, the Journal of Palestinian Studies, the North American Congress on Latin America Report on the Americas, and in 2 edited volumes on the Middle East mandates and Middle Eastern diasporas. Nadim earned a joint doctorate in history and Middle Eastern and Islamic studies from New York University and a master's in Arab studies from Georgetown. From 2019 to 2020, he was awarded a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship from the Palestinian American Research Center. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nadim Bawalsa.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here tonight, for weathering this storm that has brought Amman to its knees. I'm sorry for the delay. We were also stuck in traffic for 45 minutes. In any case, I very much appreciate you being here tonight, especially given that Morocco and Spain are playing as we speak. Please feel free to interrupt me if Morocco scores. It's an honor to be here, not only for the opportunity to present my book and its findings in my hometown of Amman, and to an audience which includes family and loved ones, but to also be able to do so at the Columbia Global Center. Thank you, Hania Salah, Ahmed Musa, and Dana Bibi for this generous invitation, and thank you to Safwan Al-Masri for introducing me to the center and its staff 3 years ago. My book, Transnational Palestine, traces the journeys of the pioneering Palestinians who first started boarding ships bound for the Americas around a century and a half ago in pursuit of political stability and economic opportunity. It traces their migration and settlement patterns and the radical transformations that impacted their lives following the termination of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 and the subsequent British occupation of Palestine, which lasted for 30 years. Simply put, these migrants left their homes in Palestine as Ottoman subjects and became stateless Palestinian nationals banned from permanent return to Palestine following the establishment of the British Mandate in 1923. Their descendants remain in exile to this day. How did Britain orchestrate this exile? And how did tens of thousands of Palestinian migrants respond to it? I'll attempt to answer these questions over the course of the next 35 minutes, and I invite any which might arise for you during the Q&A that follows. Much like the mobile lives of the protagonists of this book, the book has had a journey of its own. It started in the summer of 2011. I had just begun my pre-dissertation fieldwork at the end of the first year of the PhD program at NYU. The plan was to visit the State Archive in Jerusalem and search for autobiographical sources of influential Palestinian thinkers in the early 20th century. After a couple of frustrating weeks, having found but a handful of fragmented documents in mislabeled and disorganized boxes, my good friend Frederick Mayton, who was also at the archive, approached me with a document in hand, and he said, "Nadim, can you read this? It's handwritten in Arabic, but it says Centro Social Palestino in Mexico at the top. What do you think it could be?" What Frederick handed me was a letter authored by Palestinian members of the Centro Social Palestino de Monterrey, Mexico, in February 1927. The letter's authors were addressing Musa Kazem Hosseini, president of the Arab Executive in Jerusalem at the time, asking for his support in their struggle to secure their right to Palestinian citizenship from British Mandate authorities. Evidently, British authorities had recently passed a law which the authors insisted needed to be challenged. This wasn't the only letter from the same time period and from Palestinians in Latin America that Frederick and I found that day in the box labeled Aravim, Arabs in Hebrew. Similar letters located in these two folders were authored by Palestinians representing different social collectives, much like the Centro Social Palestino, but in Cuba, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Peru, Chile, and elsewhere. Several more were addressed to al-Husseini, but many more were also addressed to the British High Commissioner for Palestine and to the League of Nations in Geneva. All shared the same message. We Palestinian migrants across the Americas demand that British authorities recognize our right to Palestinian nationality and citizenship. Nationality would ensure these migrants their rights to own, inherit, seek legal representation, and reside in Palestine. It would also guarantee them consular protection while abroad, and it would secure the conferral of their nationality on their children. For historians, finds like these are few and far between. So I'm forever indebted to my friend Frederick for thinking to ask me what that document said that day. To find these documents which spoke to the Palestinian struggle to secure a permanent and legal means to return to Palestine in the 1920s, it was clear to me there was something that needed to be unpacked. This was the birth of a dissertation project that would turn into Transnational Palestine 11 years later. This was first and foremost a history of migration and diaspora. I had to find out who were these Palestinians who migrated to every corner of the Americas. Why did they leave Palestine, and why did they form the Centro Social Palestino and many others like it? Mass migration to the Americas from Palestine began as it did elsewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. It began with the invention of the steamship in the early 19th century. Coal proved particularly effective at getting these massive ships across oceans, and port cities throughout the Mediterranean quickly opened branches for French, Italian, and Turkish boat companies. Pictured here is the French Messagerie Maritime, one of the primary boats which operated at ports in Beirut, Jaffa, and Alexandria, the origin points of all migration to the Americas from the Arab Eastern Mediterranean. The local branch of the Messagerie Maritime in Jerusalem was actually centrally located just inside of the Jaffa Gate, one of the main entry points to the Old City. Migrants from all over Greater Syria, all Ottoman subjects before 1918, took several fairly affordable routes westward aboard these ships. One of these routes is pictured here. From Jaffa, Beirut, or Alexandria, through France via Marseille, and then to one of several ports across the eastern Atlantic seaboard, this journey took at least 3 weeks. More arduous journeys often lasted longer than a month. The following account of a Palestinian from Beit Jala who migrated to Chile in the 1910s shows that it can actually take 45 days. "We first went to Lebanon to take the boat," he says. "We slept the night there. We boarded the boat and it went to Greece. There we took another ship. It was gigantic. It was an Italian ship. The first couple of days we could not eat anything. We were all seasick. The first port we came to was Marseille. There we stayed about 5 days, then to Barcelona. After Spain, we arrived to Dakar. In Dakar, we stayed 1 more day, then on to Brazil. The boat stopped in Santos. We slept a night there. Then we went to Rio de Janeiro. From Rio de Janeiro, we continued to Buenos Aires. It took 5 days. That completed the 45-day trip with stops included. But Kamel Khadwe did not end his journey at Buenos Aires. He was on his way to Santiago de Chile, which was no small feat either. Migrants arriving in Buenos Aires would link up with Arabic-speaking middlemen who would supply them with a credit line to cross the continent by train and get to Chile via Mendoza, the Argentinian border town indicated with a white diamond on the map. There's just one problem. They needed to cross the Andes Mountains, the spine of South America and the world's longest continental mountain range, stretching from the Caribbean coast of Venezuela to the Antarctic waters off the southern tips of Argentina and Chile. I took these photos during my trip to Santiago in 2014. Normally, the air pollution in the city obscures the mountains which surround it, but it rained on this day, and the view afterwards was magnificent. Crossing the Andes, even in warmer months, is challenging and requires a certain amount of expertise. But the journey, which included a long train ride from Buenos Aires to Mendoza, and an even longer ride on mules through the mountains to the nearest train station on the Chilean side of the mountains, ended with something quite spectacular. What Palestinians found on the other side of the Andes was a landscape and climate that looked and smelled exactly like home. The western slopes of the lower Andes bear a striking resemblance to the rolling hills and dry, temperate climate of Palestine. Pictured here is Illapel in 2014 when I visited. Illapel is a town of about 30,000 residents with a very large number of Palestinians whose ancestors first arrived there in the 1890s, or so they were told. Descendants of these pioneering Palestinians came primarily from Beit Jala, Beit Zahur, and Beit Lahem. And following an exhausting journey across oceans and continents, you can see why they chose this little mountain enclave as a final resting stop. So, who were these Palestinian migrants who happened to find Palestine west of the Andes? Largely, they were Christians from the towns of Beit Lahem, Beit Jala, and Beit Zahur, but they were also from Ramallah, Jerusalem, Nazareth, and elsewhere in Palestine. The pattern of migration was more or less as follows. The first to migrate were almost always young men who were fleeing conscription in the Ottoman army. These youth would initially spend a few months or years in the diaspora, or the mahjar, saving enough money to return with remittances and bring along parents, siblings, and hopefully a wife to join them on their next voyage west. Whether fleeing conscription, economic crisis, or Ottoman suppression due to political activism, thousands of Palestinians boarded ships alongside Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, Greek, and other migrants from the Mediterranean basin and headed to the New World. Importantly, though, these migrants regularly returned to Palestine with bags of money, in a tradition of bidirectional travel that became a mainstay of the Palestinian economy by the time the British arrived in 1917. An exception to this pattern of migration, one which shows how rich and layered the narratives of these pioneering migrants were, is the story of Katrina Saadeh, pictured here in the center of the photo. The modest Greek Orthodox Saadeh family from Bethlehem first migrated to Kiev in 1906, while it was part of the Russian Empire. Struggling to feed his growing family, Abdullah Saadeh, Katrina's father, who's seated on the right wearing a suit, was drawn to the Russian Empire due to then Tsar Nicholas II's interest in expanding Orthodox commercial networks. Abdullah, like most Palestinian migrants, sold Holy Land items, including olive wood crucifixes, bowls, plates. If you've been to Palestine or Madaba, you know exactly what they were selling, rosaries, and of course, mother of pearl. Katrina, who was 6 at the time of her family's migration to Kiev, grew up there. But in 1914, with economic calamity across the Russian Empire, and with the Bolshevik Revolution brewing, Abdullah fled danger in Kiev and returned home to Bethlehem. But that year also saw the Ottomans' entry into World War I against the Allied forces. An already exhausted economy was now put under wartime siege, and Abdullah couldn't feed all of his children in Bethlehem. He therefore sent 14-year-old Katrina with her sister and brother-in-law to Saltillo, Mexico, to marry Jamil Kabandi, also a Palestinian, who had settled in Mexico a decade earlier. So Katrina, who by then spoke a combination of broken Russian and Arabic, was sent halfway across the world to marry a man she did not know in a Spanish-speaking country. And she was 14. Certainly, this was better than hunger in Palestine. Katrina arrived in Saltillo, married Jamil, who by then had changed his name to Emilio. Most migrants Latinized their names upon arrival, and began a life as part of the town's growing Palestinian Jalia, or migrant community. Katrina had 2 children with Jamil, but Jamil was killed in a train accident in 1916, and one of their children died of the flu that year. By 1921, widowed Katrina took her surviving daughter, Julia, and traveled to South San Francisco in California, where her sister and brother-in-law had settled a few years prior. There, Katrina had her second marriage to a Palestinian from Ramallah, Suleiman Farhat, with whom she had 2 more children, one of whom is pictured here sitting on his father's lap. The remainder of Katrina's story is fascinating, including fleeing debt during the US Great Depression, briefly returning to her in-laws in Ramallah, a family scandal which drove her to run away from Palestine with her children aboard a ship she took from Haifa and returned to the United States, and finally, divorce from Suleiman in 1936, while she was in the United States and while he was in Palestine. I'm certainly the first transnational divorce to have taken place in Palestine. Katrina subsequently lived the rest of her life in the United States. But I asked Kathy Kenny, Katrina's granddaughter, who shared with me her grandmother's letters, which she wrote in the 1920s and 30s to her sister, how her grandmother identified. She was born in Palestine, but only spent the first 6 years of her life there, and then mere months during her adolescence and early adulthood. Did she identify as a Palestinian while she was in California? Did she say she was an Arab? Evidently, Katrina preferred to identify as Syrian if it came to it. As many of us know, the legal and political categories which we use today to designate nationalities in our region did not exist in their current form just 1 century ago. Greater Syria included Lebanon and Palestine as its western and southern regions, respectively. This is to say that while the terms Lebanon and Palestine were used before the Europeans carved the region into mandates, they were not yet used to differentiate nationally between the people of the region. Palestinian and Lebanese, the terms Palestinian and Lebanese signify geographic, cultural, political, and linguistic variations among Syrian communities of Greater Syria. Fundamentally, they were all first and foremost Syrians and Arabs, though some communities rejected the term Arab on political and racial grounds, and they were all officially Ottoman subjects. As an interesting example of this fluid identification in this early period, in October 1912, an article was published by the Syrian community in El Zaman, an Arabic newspaper based in Argentina. The article was titled, "Who Are We and What Are We Called?" and it was reprinted in the famous Jaffa-based Philistine newspaper on the 12th of October. The article described an incident that occurred among the Syrian Jalia in Chile regarding the community's preferred mode of identification. Evidently, some members of the Jalia insisted to call themselves Ottomans, while others wanted to be called Syrians. The editors of Philistine newspaper had the following to say to their readers on the topic. "We see that the right decision was made by the immigrants of the District of Palestine because they requested to be addressed as Ottomans, no more and no less, and not as Turkish, Syrian, or Palestinian, which separates the hearts rather than unifying them." This is a significant example not only because it conveys the layers of the debate of self and group identification in this delicate phase of the region's history, but also because it shows just how interconnected these communities already were by the time the Europeans arrived in 1917 and subsequently severed Greater Syria into mandates. Residents of and migrants from Greater Syria, as far away as Argentina and Chile, were in contact, and they were posing existential questions and sharing them with compatriots back home. Likewise, newspapers in Palestine were promoting the notion of unity, especially in light of increasing migration and the expansion of migrant networks across the diaspora. On the one hand, it is important to affirm the historical unity of Greater Syria, but it's also important to recognize that there were nonetheless territorial demarcations put in place by the Ottomans. These porous boundaries were mostly used for taxation purposes and for Ottoman census records, which is actually why we're able today to ascertain numbers of migrants from different parts of the empire. Based on Ottoman censuses conducted towards the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, an estimated 1.8 million people resided in Greater Syria at the turn of the century. Between 1860 and 1920, an estimated 600,000 persons emigrated from the region to both North and South America. As for Ottoman southern Syria, known as Palestine, it consisted of the sanjaks of Akka and Nablus within the state or vilayeh of Beirut, as well as the autonomous mutasarrifat of Jerusalem. The bottom two yellow and orange sections of the map. The population of the two sanjaks and the mutasarrifat was approximately 600,000 in 1900. And migrants from these two areas amounted to approximately 10,000 by the start of World War I in 1914, and over 40,000 by 1936. But as we know, the arrival of British forces into Jerusalem in December 1917 marked the end of Ottoman rule and the transition into a new age of European mandates. The infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 severed Greater Syria and Iraq to reflect the interest of European forces, leaving us the borders we know today, roughly. In 1921, the League of Nations ratified the British and French mandates, which were meant to be temporary, guiding the peoples of the regions to self-determination. This short-sighted mission was muddled, of course, by the 1917 Balfour Declaration, through which Britain promised the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland to see to the establishment in Palestine of, quote, a national home for the Jewish people. How they would do this while honoring their promise to the Palestinians, well, we know all too well that they simply did not. The Balfour Declaration also featured in the text of the British Mandate for Palestine. Article 7 of the mandate stipulated that the government of Palestine shall enact a nationality law through which it would facilitate the naturalization as British Palestinian subjects of the nearly 400,000 Jewish immigrants who would come to settle Palestine over the course of Britain's 30-year occupation there. The nationality law used to naturalize these settlers, known as the Palestinian Citizenship Order in Council, was promulgated in July 1925. Through it, tens of thousands of Palestinian citizenship certificates were issued, and most to European Jews, such as this one pictured here, issued to a Leopold Kopfel. I'll put the slide up, but I'll also read it to convey just how skewed and lopsided British mandate policy was in practice during this period. Between 1925 and 1929, out of a total of 20,168 applications for Palestinian citizenship, 15,551 were approved. Non-Jewish naturalization accounted for only 1% of this total. On March 8, 1937, British colonial authorities reported that more than 28,000 Jews had been naturalized in Palestine between 1931 and 1936, and that out of a total of 4,941 certificates of citizenship granted in 1936, 4,847 were given to Jews. Meanwhile, by 1937, about 9,000 applications for citizenship had been submitted by Palestinians residing in Latin America, and, quote, of those, not more than 100 were accepted. This continued for the duration of Britain's occupation of Palestine until 1948. As for why British authorities regularly denied Palestinian migrants their applications for citizenship, they had several reasons. These are just a few of my favorite. Insufficient proof of intention to remain permanently in Palestine, insufficient proof of connection to Palestine, which is absolutely absurd even within international law, which recognizes your right to nationality based on blood, birth, or lineage. Absence for a period longer than 12 years, which was in fact an entirely arbitrary number. If you look at the correspondences between British officials, they truly randomly chose 12. The migrants' patent undesirability, which was to be determined by the immigration officer. And finally, these migrants, quote, cannot be held to have had direct connection with Palestine except under the Ottoman regime, or to have any legitimate claim to be considered Palestinians or to British protection. Therefore, they are not and never have been Palestinians. Meanwhile, Jews entered Palestine virtually without check of any kind, as John Shuckburgh, head of the Middle East Department of the Colonial Office in London, said in May 1925. Of course, British authorities were fully aware of this biased policy, In fact, I found all these numbers in internal communiques written between British officials, stored today in England's National Archives. They were also fully aware that they were contravening international law. In 1923, the Allied forces and the defeated Ottomans, or the Turks at this point, signed the Treaty of Lausanne, which was officially ratified a year later on August 6, 1924. The treaty delineated the sovereign borders of the new Turkish Republic in exchange for Turkish authorities officially relinquishing all claims to territories they once held in the Arab world. This extended to any claims they had over any residents of these territories, including those residing abroad. As a result, all these former Ottoman subjects were stripped of Ottoman nationality and came under the trusteeship of mandate authorities. As for residents of these territories who were residing abroad, Article 34 of the Treaty of Lausanne gave them the right to, quote, opt for the nationality of the territory of which they are natives, if they belong by race to the majority of the population of that territory. This was based on the three legal criteria laid out in the treaty for qualifying for nationality. Nationality through birth on the land, through blood lineage, through your parents, or through long-term residence. The treaty thus officially promulgated Palestinian nationality globally and protected Palestinians' right to it from wherever they were in the world. This is precisely why tens of thousands of Palestinian migrants applied for Palestinian nationality and therefore citizenship. They qualified for it through birth and or blood. But this is where the governance of Palestine gets tricky. As a territory promised to the Zionists, the League of Nations in Geneva, which was tasked with managing the mandates, left the administration of Palestine entirely to the discretion of the British Crown, a British Crown which had clear interests in following through with Balfour's promise. International law, including the Treaty of Lausanne, therefore did not apply to Palestine. But when I found these documents in the National Archive in London, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. What about all those documents Frederick and I found in the State Archive in Jerusalem? I needed to know how Palestinians in the diaspora responded to this injustice, which meant that the missing piece was in Latin America. What I found in the National Library of Chile in Santiago in 2014 was unprecedented. In hundreds of newspapers and petitions addressed to Jerusalem, London, Geneva, and elsewhere across the British domains, Palestinians and their allies across the Americas spoke up and objected to Britain's abuse of power, demanding redress. This is also where I locate the shift in self and group identification among Palestinian migrants. While they still identified as Syrians or Arabs, what British mandate authorities did by denying them Palestinian citizenship was cement the sense among them that they were and would always be Palestinians. On April 23, 1927, for example, a Palestinian migrant in Trujillo, Honduras, said the following in a petition he addressed to the League of Nations after his application for citizenship was denied, along with several others. We are Palestinians, born, bred, and reared, and no power on earth can sever our claims and rights as Palestinians. I want to give you a sense for the language these Palestinians used in their petitions. They had clearly done their homework. They'd read up on the legal jargon, including the Treaty of Lausanne and Article 34, and on the relationship between the League of Nations and the mandates in terms of authority. These petitions were almost all first authored in Arabic or Spanish, but they were then translated into English upon delivery to the nearest British consular office, whether in Mexico City, Santiago, Lima, Sao Paulo, or elsewhere. I'll read excerpts from one petition which I find represents the majority. It was written on February 23, 1927, by Vice President of the Centro Social Palestino, Abraham Masso, and Secretary B.J. Qawas of the same organization. To His Excellency Field Marshal Lord Plumer, High Commissioner, Government of Palestine, Jerusalem, Palestine. Sir, we the undersigned, native-born Palestinians, residents of the cities of Monterrey, Saltillo, Chihuahua, and San Pedro, Republic of Mexico, do hereby most respectfully solicit your aid in the solution of a problem which for us is most serious. We have always maintained contact with our native land and continue to cultivate those ties of blood, language, tradition, and all other ethnic and social associations which go to make up a native land. We believe we are entitled to consider ourselves Palestinians. We were born in that territory, have always wished to be Palestinians, and we are sure, if as a last resort it shall become necessary to carry our petition before the League of Nations, that august body will grant us the right to consider ourselves nationals of Palestine. We believe, sir, with all due respect, that the decision of the Palestine government as expressed by you does not in any way agree with the spirit of the treaties nor the clearly manifested intention of the League of Nations to foster, encourage, and revive the small nations which before the war were subject to others. Signed on behalf of the members of the Palestinian colonies by the Centro Social Palestino. Pictured here is the first of 5 pages of over 300 signatures. Note the letterhead, which says Hijos de Palestina, Sons of Palestine Committee in Saltillo, Mexico. The first line in handwritten Arabic indicates that this committee collected these signatures and sent them to the Centro Social Palestino in Monterrey in order to add the names of Palestinians in Saltillo to the Monterrey petition. Palestinians across Mexico were very much connected, and they were very much politically active. Over the course of mandate rule in the interwar period, more than 3,000 appeals and petitions reached the League of Nations in Geneva. Certainly most were rejected. The majority, at 43.3%, concerned Syria, or Palestine more specifically. Palestinians across the Americas also protested British and French mandate policies in newspapers. What I found in the microfilms of the National Library of Chile, home today to the world's largest population of Palestinians outside of the Arab world, roughly 500,000, was a treasure trove. The archive houses more than 10 journals and periodicals published by the Syrian Jalia. These are just some of the most prolific. Apart from the wealth of information I was able to glean about the lives of these first Syrian diaspora communities, which of course included Palestinians and Lebanese, and about the many difficulties and successes they faced, these Arabic and Spanish newspapers showed unequivocally that the development of collective Palestinian national consciousness occurred transnationally across borders, not just in Palestine. In one newspaper issue after the other, following the installment of the mandates in Greater Syria, Palestinians and their Syrian and Lebanese counterparts called on one another to secure their rights from mandate authorities and to protect Palestine from the Zionist threat. They were fully aware of the Balfour Declaration and of Britain's duplicitous plan in Palestine, and they were also fully aware that the denial of their citizenship applications was part of this plan. In article after article, newspaper editors warned their readers of the dangers of European imperialism and of the importance of safeguarding the rights of Palestinians to their nationality. In addition to encouraging them to go to the British consulate in Santiago and submit applications for citizenship, newspaper editors urged Palestinians to join the Committee for the Defense of the National Rights of Palestinians, which formed in Santiago in 1927. In fact, a similar committee, named the Committee for the Defense of the Rights of Palestinians Residing in Foreign Countries, also formed in Beit Jala that year, members of which marched to the offices of the government of Palestine in Jerusalem alongside Musa Kazem al-Husseini to deliver their own petition in defense of the rights of their compatriots in the diaspora. These documents suggest not only that collective Palestinian consciousness developed outside of Palestine, but that for Palestinians it was inextricably linked to Britain continually denying their rights to be considered Palestinians. This identification as Palestinian and with Palestine is quite palpable in Chile to this day. One of the country's main football clubs is named the Club Deportivo Palestino, and it was formed in 1920 by Palestinian migrants in Chile. Chile is home also to some of the largest and most frequent anti-Israeli occupation marches and demonstrations in the world. Sorry for the selfie, but this was 2014. I did not think I would be here today. There are also many examples of the imprint of Palestinians and other Arabic-speaking migrants on the social fabric of Chile. What are the implications of this historical narrative for our understanding of Palestinian history and for our understanding of the current day reality of Palestinians? First, the historical study of Palestine and the Palestinian people need not be limited to geographic Palestine or to British and Israeli colonial archives. Our documents, our historical records, are stored in archives and personal collections across the world, and they house stories that need to be told. Second, the British mandate for Palestine was designed with fundamental inequities that at no point throughout their occupation of Palestine did British authorities seek to rectify. In fact, it's arguable that the success of the mandate was predicated on these inequities. Connected to this is the blaring truth that whether 100 years ago or today, Palestine continues to be an exception when it comes to the application of international law. By the time they left Palestine in 1948, British mandate authorities had denied 40,000 Palestinians their right to their nationality, enshrined in the Treaty of Lausanne, which the British authorities signed themselves. The subsequent colonizers of Palestine, the Zionists, have simply been continuing a practice of exiling Palestinians and keeping them in exile since they formed their regime in 1948. And as we know too well, accountability in international law continues to magically be overlooked when it comes to the Israeli regime's violations of a litany of international legal treaties. But with the structures of international legal governance largely unchanged since World War I, it would be foolish to believe anything would be different to this day. What this means, as far as I'm concerned, for the ongoing pursuit of justice for Palestinians, whether in Palestine or across the world, is that we must move on from centering our liberation struggle or our exile around, move on from centering it around our right to return. Our rights mean nothing so long as the status quo exists. It carries little significance against regimes of oppression that daily circumvent international law with impunity. I certainly don't have the answer for liberation, I'm just a historian, but it strikes me as critical at this moment of increasing global solidarity with Palestinians for us to realize the extent of our exile, the extent of our numbers, of our resources, of our experiences and our capabilities, and to mobilize around them. Our ancestors in Monterrey, Saltillo, and Santiago taught us that we should use our numbers and our geographic fragmentation to our advantage. The very fact that our struggle to belong to Palestine from exile began in 1925 and not 1948, and that it includes millions of descendants of Palestinians scattered as far away as the Chilean Andes and the Mexican desert, should compel us to forge expansive networks of Palestinians to somehow collectively strategize how to safeguard our connections to the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Our exile does not need to be irreversible. Ironically, 19th century European Jews showed us just how effective this type of strategizing can be. Whether this starts with establishing a Department of Palestinian Diaspora Studies at Columbia University, with reviving a defunct Palestine Liberation Organization to represent us globally, or with creating forums across the world for us to literally come together, register our immense numbers, and share our stories. However we choose to do it, our diaspora is much more significant than we know. And it's my contention through this book that we need to activate it. Thank you.
Would you like to take questions one at a time, or?
I think we said maybe really.
Oh, okay.
If there's any.
You don't mind whoever's asking to introduce yourselves?
Thank you, Dr. Nadim. My name is Bassem Saeed, your uncle. I have a question, Nadim. I once heard your podcast. I can't remember on which program. Very interesting. Could you remind us the difference between nationality and citizenship? You explained it in the podcast. I can't remember. I think it's interesting and it's relevant to the audience today and to your talk. And international law today, in light of what you just said, how relevant is it? And I mean, people go about disregarding international law completely. So as you pointed out, is it relevant today? And I don't know how. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Thank you, Khalo. I think I'll start with the second question just because it's more connected to the final slides. International law is certainly significant, even if it doesn't apply to indigenous populations of color across the world, or even if it doesn't apply to Palestine, it still has a force. I mean, there are still international criminal justice organizations like the ICJ and the ICC to hold governments accountable for violations of international law. However, there's limits to what international law can do when we have certain arrangements like the one we have between the Western world and Israel and the Zionist movement that predates international law. I mean, it started in the 19th century. So these decisions, these agreements predated the texts that they signed themselves. So there was no accountability, there's no structure in place to hold them accountable to the documents they signed because they are the authority. So this doesn't mean that there shouldn't be international law. It just means that somehow populations that continually fall outside of it, such as Palestinians, can somehow strategize around it. Which doesn't mean that if we all come together, there are millions from Chile to there are populations of Palestinians in the Philippines, historians have found. If we all come together, it doesn't mean that we're suddenly going to descend upon Palestine and take it back. No, but it can start with securing rights, if not through reparations. I mean, that would be brilliant at this point. But at least to rights to own at some point, to somehow lay claim to properties, to inheritance, to infrastructure, to build, to contribute somehow to the land between the river and the sea. It might not apply to 1948 territories today, but it could at least start in the occupied territories. So that's for that. International law certainly has limitations, but I wouldn't want to imagine a world without it at this point. In terms of citizenship and nationality, this is a very important point, and it's something that multiple regimes of power, definitely the British and Zionist regimes, have manipulated deliberately for centuries or for decades. Nationality supersedes citizenship. Citizenship is a very small concept, and it's a document. It's an arrangement, an agreement that a national of a land, even if they're not related to it by blood, they could just have lived there for a certain amount of time, goes into with a state government. It's an agreement that you will abide by a certain set of laws in exchange for certain privileges. Certainly the most important one is travel. We cannot travel without passports. So this is the concept of citizenship. We are citizens of a state. We're not citizens of a land. Nationality is broadly defined as the genuine link. This is the term the ICJ came up with in the 1950s. It's the genuine link between an individual and that land, irrespective of the document they hold. That connection is confirmed either by blood, so your parents, grandparents, and so on, or birth, or long-term residency. And each state has a certain number of years that they require for you to then apply for nationality. Nationality cannot be taken from you by a state. A state cannot denationalize you. A state can definitely denaturalize you by revoking your citizenship, which Israel does repeatedly. And this is, in fact, why they have a regime of residency permits for Palestinians in Jerusalem, for example, because it's very easy to revoke them with no consequence, as we see just now happening with Salah Hamouri. So if there is this fundamental difference between these two concepts, what Palestinians can do, and in fact what the PLO tried to do in 2012 was, after the United Nations recognized Palestine as a de jure state, sovereign state, was draft a nationality law which defined any Palestinian across the world as a Palestinian since the Treaty of Lausanne. The treaty is applicable today, and the PLO went ahead and presented this document. Of course, the PLO, as we know, has been unable to get much done since the Palestinian Authority has entrenched its power and limited the impact of the representative of the Palestinian people across the world. So in fact, one of our obstacles now is not just Israel, it's our own leadership. But importantly, the Palestinian Authority is only mandated within the West Bank and Gaza. So it can't even speak on our behalf in exile. It needs to be through a governing body or representative body. If not the PLO, then maybe we need a new one. Maybe it can include Chilean Palestinians who are immensely powerful within Chile, not just in terms of their wealth, but in terms of their political potency. They are in government. They speak loudly and proudly as Palestinians. It's the only country truly where I've been outside of the Middle East where saying you're Palestinian and Chilean, and the nationality of the other country that you're hosted in, is a sign of pride. The photos I showed of the demonstrations in Chile, no one spoke Arabic. No one, from what I could see, was Palestinian visibly. Everyone spoke Spanish. This was entirely a Chilean event. So there's something to be said about mobilizing these populations that, through no fault of their own, it's also our fault. Our leadership has not tapped into these expansive networks. It might be time to try to do that, to try to stake a claim to nationality, if not through international law, then at least amongst ourselves, so that then we can present something like the Zionists did in the 18th century, 19th century. We go to a certain power that be, and we maybe try to see if they can have, get a benefit out of having us stake claims to this land with our wealth, with our resources, with our expansive networks, with our trade networks and so on. Really, it's ironic that the Zionists really gave us a really strong example of what it means to mobilize in exile or in the diaspora.
I'm Michel Ayoub, my name is.
Sorry, there were two questions at once.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
I'm Michel Ayoub. I want to ask why you think there was so much grudge against the Palestinians during the mandate. Was this all the Zionist influence on Britain? Thank you.
Zionist influence on Britain?
No.
Britain.
I mean Zionist influence in Britain against, why so much grudge against the Palestinians even then? Thank you.
I think that's a brilliant question. If I had more time to present many more slides about the documents I found in the National Archive in London, to call them racist would be simple and easy. Certainly all mandate authorities, all colonizers had a certain conception of the peoples they were colonizing. It wasn't a grudge so much as it was quite literally, there is a limited number of immigrants and settlers we can implant on the land of Palestine. It's such a small territory, and it's very limited in its agricultural output, as we know. If we are going to start allowing tens of thousands of incoming Jews and tens of thousands of returning Palestinians, no, our priority is the Jews. Obviously, not only are they more patently desirable because they are Jews, and therefore, of course, there's a lot of racialization of Jews in this context. It's quite obvious. It was quite evident in the documents that they were saying we much prefer a European, East European Jew to a lazy Arab. It was that simple, and they were not hiding it from one another. Of course, they're not going to publicize this in the mandate, in the text for the mandate itself. What's interesting is that British authorities didn't know how many Palestinians would qualify for citizenship, for Palestinian citizenship and nationality, of course, through the law that they promulgated in 1925. They were actually shocked. They said, this is unprecedented. We're being flooded by citizenship applications. We can't accept them all. Absolutely not. And then between one another, they would say these things that I showed and read. They can't prove that they're connected. They can't prove that they intend to stay. They can't prove that they're Palestinian because they left as Ottomans. Sort of very easily arguable points. But of course, a Palestinian migrant in Saltillo, Mexico, couldn't say much beyond the obvious. Yes, I am Palestinian. Yes, I was born there. My parents were born there. So it wasn't so much a grudge as much as it was what are their priorities? And 40,000 Palestinian migrants were not their priorities. In one of the communiques, they said to one another, well, if they were Ottoman subjects, they should now go to the Turkish consulates and seek Turkish nationality. In response, several Palestinian collectives like the Centro Social would say, we are not Turkish, have never been, and never want to be. In fact, you just liberated us from the Turks. How could you ask us to go seek Turkish citizenship? This is an absurdity. The British would simply say to one another, this is negligible, please ignore. It wasn't a grudge so much as, why care if they didn't have to? And I think this continues to be the case.
Thanks for the lecture. My name is Mahim Qasim. My question is, was there a realization of a Palestinian identity before the beginning of the 20th century, or was the public awareness a realization of an Arab national identity? Thanks.
If I understand it, is it a question of how separate was a sense of Palestinian collective identity from a larger Arab identity before World War I and before in the 19th century? So this is separate from this presentation, but it's very relevant, of course, and I wish I had had more time to sort of chart the growth of, or the development of separate political nationalities in the region out of the Nahda movement, which was all about Arabism and connection and, unity around our language, which was the movement that swept through much of the region in the late 19th century. There was never a sense amongst these migrant communities in the diaspora or amongst communities here that there was, this was the point I made, and perhaps I should have developed it more, that there was a contradiction between calling yourself an Arab and then a Palestinian, or a Lebanese and an Arab, or a Syrian and an Arab. Certainly the Lebanese had a harder time accepting the word Arab, and in some of the sources I found before 1914, so before the Ottomans entered the war and subsequently lost, Palestinians, well, the Syrian Jalia, which included all the members of this region, were saying, if we accept to be called Arab, and they were saying this in the diaspora, then we're going to be lumped with the larger populations of the region, meaning the Arabs of Arabia, the Gulf. We are not them, they are not us. So there was also this tension around this, but the idea of Arabism as a movement to bring about collective consciousness or awareness or identity around a shared language and heritage, yes, this was part of what it meant to also call yourself Palestinian. So you could say that both. You could say, أنا عربي وأنا فلسطيني, أنا عربي من فلسطين, أنا عربي من لبنان, أنا عربي من سوريا. These were not seen as contradictory in any way. And then the point of the book is to show that after the Ottomans were kicked out, after the Europeans divided the region, because they kept continually denying the identity, the political, geographic, historical, linguistic identity of these populations, the Palestinian populations, that they deliberately started saying that they were Palestinians first and foremost. So that's when in the 20s, the early 20s, you start seeing them using words like Centro Social Palestino, not Centro Social Árabe. Or you also had collectives that were Club Sirio-Palestino or Sirio-Libanese. So there was this idea that these hybrid identities could be brought together in a deliberate political response to the British and French authorities trying to divide them. So it was a delicate time, and including Katrina Saadeh, who until the day she died insisted that she was Syrian, even though she'd never been to current-day Syria. I hope this answers your question, but it would require a lot more research into the pre-war period that I didn't do for this book. But based on the sources I found in this period, there was never a sense that you had to be one or the other.
Hi, thank you so much for this really interesting and really other academic routes in being able to discuss this. That's something that's very challenging at my university and resulted in 2 years ago, we had a professor who taught a class called Colonizing Palestine that was met very negatively, and he was fired. However, it's the only class in years to even talk about Palestine. So I'm really curious from your experience in academia in the United States, and just from what you've read and your research, what is the advice or best way to kind of start to tackle more of this challenge and problem? Because it's at the core of international affairs and just humanity and human rights, and unfortunately there's no platform in a lot of the best institutions in the world to even be able to speak about this. So that's my question for you.
Thank you very much. And this gets at the heart of why I left academia, to be honest. I now work as an editor for a Palestine policy think tank, and that's where I find my 12 plus years of graduate work on Palestinian history to be most effective. The other thing, though, I did leave the United States 3 years ago, and I have not regretted it since. Mostly because of just how frustrating it was to try to speak as a Palestinian about Palestine and academic institutions in the United States, even though I was in the Department of Middle East Studies at NYU, and that was a safe space, but branching out of that in any way, as I'm sure you know, was challenging. I didn't want to subject myself to what the professor went through. I couldn't deal with that. It would just destroy me. So what I really believe is the answer, as part of this presentation, is we need to look outside of the United States, and we need to look outside of Europe. We are everywhere. And we are wealthy, and we have resources, and we are connected, and we are political, and we own, I'm thinking Chile especially, but Honduras, Mexico. These are the places where these departments and these types of networks and institutions can be formed. It's also about activating them, because at this point it's been over 100 years for many of them, and they've become assimilated to great extent, and for many of them saying, like many of us here in Jordan, just next door, what's the point of being politically active when we know the status quo? Sure. Absolutely, I understand this, and having been to Chile and spoken to many people there, there's also the same sort of sense of, what's the point? So long as these regimes of power in place, what's the point? But I did meet some academics in the University of Chile in Santiago. There is a center for Arab studies at the University of Chile. All the faculty there who teach are Palestinos Chilenos. They're Palestinian Chileans. They know their history. None of them knew that the archives down the road had these newspapers. When I came, because very few of them speak Arabic or read Arabic, when I came, they were stunned. They said, how could this be right here and we have no idea? I said, you tell me. But now that this exists, I'm really hoping this book, and hopefully others will come out subsequently, if not books, articles or presentations, papers at conferences, anything. If we tap into these regions, why do we have the Middle East Studies Association, which is the biggest, it's the mecca of Middle East studies? The one meeting that is held every year is only held in North America. Why? Why? Half the world can't enter the United States to participate. We know there are immigration restrictions. Why aren't we doing this in Mexico City? Why aren't we doing it in Buenos Aires or Santiago, where millions more people can attend, and millions more who are actually Palestinian and have a stake in this that's not just academic or political, it's personal. I don't have the time to start these institutes, but that's the hope. That's the hope.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak today. My name is Alicia Talamas. So my first name is Spanish and my last name is Palestinian. So I'm actually the product of this research that you have been doing. My mother is Mexican, my father's Palestinian. My father's family immigrated to Mexico from Bethlehem in the years that you were talking about. And I actually saw my family name in the documents of signatures that you were talking about, Marcos, which is actually the sort of Spanish version, like you said, similar to like Emilio, originally being Morcos, which is still a very prominent family in Bethlehem and Beit Sahur. And so, yeah.
Yeah, welcome.
So thank you so much. So I really do appreciate it from the bottom of my heart, all the work that you've putting into this, because my entire life I've felt like not enough attention was being given to this, because I mean, like you said, there are huge numbers of us all over the world, specifically Latin America. Mexico, I mean, my family is from Monterrey and Torreon, which is in Coahuila, the two cities that you were discussing. And I mean, I, for one, for example, never even knew that this existed, that what you're talking about, these institutions in Mexico. And I mean, I am the most actively politically active person in my family. And so I want to ask you, what do you, looking more at the finer details, think that we should be doing as the younger generations who are now more integrated into these other cultures? Yani, mumkin it's Mexico or Santiago, Chile. What can we be doing to sort of gather these forces together, and maybe even, like you said, make Mexico and Santiago sort of these hubs for us Palestinians, instead of focusing maybe so much on this, what seems impossible idea of going back to Palestine, and kind of creating stronger numbers there? Is it through institutions? Is it through academic work? Is it through the government? And then kind of a follow-up question to that would be, how important is us having the support of these Palestinian authorities? How important is that to actually see these potentially new institutions come to life? Because, I mean, like you said, not much attention is being given to it, but if we gather these numbers, a lot of potential power could be coming from here.
Well, ahla wa sahla. It's really, really wonderful. Thank you for that introduction. Jesus Talamas was actually the founder of the Hijos de Palestina committee, the document, the first document I showed with the signatures. So I imagine that was an ancestor of yours. What can youth be doing? Well, I think a good example of what youth have been doing and should continue to do is exactly what has brought us to where we are today in terms of global solidarity around the Palestinian cause, which has largely been youth-driven, and it's been based on social media, as you know, since the Unity Intifada of 2001. I think we're just getting started. And so this isn't to say that something more should be done. I think we should continue what we are doing. I mean, I've never imagined this kind of solidarity across the world, never. I mean, Bella Hadid, what she's doing alone when you see her on social media, of course, Muhammad al-Kurd and Muna al-Kurd, it's happening, it's moving, and at this point, I really think it's about continuing to follow these accounts and post them and reshare them. And I'm terrible. I only have Instagram, and it's a very closed. I have 500 followers, and I follow maybe 600. But what I hear about Twitter and Facebook and all these other things, and TikTok at this point, I guess, is that this is where things are happening. This is where politics and liberation are being discussed. So continue that. In terms of our leadership. So I'm not talking about the PA. The PA, as I said, again, since Oslo has been stuck to the West Bank and Gaza, okay? If we're talking about the PLO, which is the only officially recognized representative of the Palestinian people across the world, so Palestinians in exile, we, by the way, have representatives in the PLO, if for those of us who didn't know this, they have been dormant and of course silenced, and of course they've been unable to do much of what they would have otherwise been able to do before Oslo, mostly because of the Oslo agreements and what they did to the Palestinian liberation movement. It turned it into a state agenda. Of course, we cannot have a state and made out of Swiss cheese, as we know. So it's a farce, and it's a joke, and that's the PA's territory. What the PLO can still do, and this is something we talk about a lot in the Shabaka, the organization I work with, there are still networks and pockets of Palestinian sort of former PLO diplomats or members of the PLO, certainly in Washington, D.C., in national capitals across the world, definitely in Latin America, though perhaps less activated. It's an older generation who might be less engaged in this kind of discussion. But what they can do is they still have the name, they still have the credentials, they still have the access that younger activists such as ourselves could tap into, could sort of could use to enter into these political spaces that have international visibility. I'm not saying that you and I should go to the UN and demand nationality tomorrow, but the fact that Muhammad al-Kurd could go to the UN, give a speech, mock them for their so-called laws that scare the occupation authorities, that's precedent. We have access. And part of that is making ourselves visible. If we use our leaders to do that, we have to be careful. What are their backgrounds? What are their interests? What are their agendas? We know too well that political leaders, don't come without baggage. But I do think that we should think outside of our political leadership ultimately. If we are to use them, let's use them strategically. This old guard, But otherwise, leadership is happening every day. Muhammad al-Kurd is a leader. We are leaders. I don't think of myself as a leader, but the people I work with in Shabake, who are living under occupation, whether in Gaza or Ramallah or Nablus, what they are writing, the policy recommendations they're putting out there for the broader Western world, these are leaders in the making. Again, so it goes back to continuing to forge these networks, which I think are largely online these days. So if we don't see things changing in the street necessarily, doesn't mean there aren't things happening behind the scenes. So I hope we just continue on this path.
Thank you very much for this lecture. My name is Mohammed Al-Isa. I'm Jordanian, but my roots from Palestine, what we called it Palestine. I feel, maybe it is a repeated question, but I need to know your idea, because you are a researcher in this field and this is your specialty. How can, I see there is contradiction or conflict. How I am denying the occupation of British forces, or what we called it colonialism, and accept the map they draw and the flag they draw, and accept the nationality they invented and ask for it. If I want to be free, I should refuse all of these. Yes. Refuse what they called it Palestine, because they draw it. Yeah. They give a flag. They give this nationality. They invented it. And if I accept this, how can I deny that they give the nationality to Jews? If they have the right to draw a country and make a nationality, they have the right to accept what they want. So how can I understand this conflict? Thank you.
I agree. How? I think it's important to separate the map that we know to be Palestine today, which was drawn by colonial forces, from the land, which has never not been called Palestine. So the land between the river and the sea has always, since Roman times, since before that, been known as Palestine or Palestina or some iteration of Palestine. If we're talking about the borders that extend down to the Red Sea, for example, certainly this was a British colonial strategy to have access to the Red Sea. But the idea that from Gaza up to the Galilee, that this land has been called Palestine for millennia, there's no doubt about this. If you look at the text of the first Zionists, they said, where do we settle? Palestine or Argentina? They were talking there. This is Theodore Herzl was considering the two. There was no doubt that it was called Palestine. So how do we accept the borders, the flag? So I'm not a fan of the flag, to be honest. I'm not a fan of flags to begin with. And certainly the fact that half of the ones in our region look alike should tell us something, that they're not ours. They were drawn for us, and the colors were chosen for us. The bagpipes, for God's sake. So we need to start somewhere. And if the status quo right now is these borders, is this flag that represents us, is this national anthem, is so on and so forth, that has nothing to do with the land before 100 years ago when they came. it's still something. It still has political significance that we need to strategize how to manipulate to our benefit. I don't know what that looks like yet because we haven't gotten anywhere close. But if we have if each Palestinian in exile has documents, forget keys, of course so many of us have keys, if we have documents proving our parents' birth there, or land inheritance, and the piece of land, the Talamas family all over Mexico own most of Bethlehem still. In theory, I mean, if we could apply our nationality. This is a starting point. I'm not saying it's the answer, but it's a starting point. We haven't strategized as an exiled people. We have not. We have not come together and learned who we are, what our family names are. Yani, when I went to Chile, they called me Palestino del País. Is a Palestinian from the homeland. And I said, no, I wish I could say I'm from Palestine. I'm Palestinian, but I'm a Jordanian citizen. Palestino del País, Palestino del País. You know, the fact that they don't understand that it's about geographic proximity to Palestine. I mean, if we can go to Iapel, the small town, which is the size of Madaba, in the middle of the Andes, and meet Hajjars, Najjars, Talamas, Dawoods, of course some of their names have been Latinized a bit, but not really. And they gave me documents that their great-grandparents came with from Palestine, proving birth, proving citizenship, Ottoman citizenship documents connecting them to Palestine, which should then have been transferred to the British after 1923, but weren't. I mean, these documents exist. Finding them, connecting with them, somehow politically, using them strategically, politically, this has to be a starting point for something. I mean, at this point, why not? Why not try this?
We'll be taking one last question, but before we do, I just wanted to point out that there are flyers. If you can't wait to read the book, you can scan it, the QR code, and then there is a discount at the bottom. Thank you, Nadim. And also, if you're interested in reading a physical copy of the book, it will soon be available at Readers and DNA. If you'd like, come find me after at the reception in the courtyard, and I can take your names and numbers so that when the book is available, they'll contact you. And yeah, okay.
Thank you, Dana.
Last question.
يعطيك العافية Nadim. I'm his brother, I can call him Nadim. I'm wondering how the communities in Latin America that are, let's say, Egyptian or Syrian or Algerian, I mean, how do they differ from Palestinian communities in the Middle East?
How do they differ from Palestinian?
So like in Chile, for example, how do the Egyptian communities there, or the Algerian communities there, or the Syrian communities there, how do they differ from the Palestinian communities there?
Oh yeah, well, first of all, they can visit those countries very easily. The Palestino Chilenos I met in Chile, many of them have been to Palestine. Many of them, after a certain point, have been banned, like many of us, because of the political activism or things they wrote or so on. So I would say that for other migrant communities from the Middle East in Chile or elsewhere in Latin America, it's just another diaspora. It doesn't have this crisis of access or crisis of return or crisis of laying claim to property, to rights, to inheritance, to whatever. So these diaspora communities, Algerian Chileans, for example, Egyptian Chileans, I haven't met any, but that would be really cool. They can own and inherit in Algeria and in Egypt, but no problem, as Algerian nationals, as Egyptian nationals. Unlike us, like you and I, when we go to Palestine, we go as US citizens. We're not recognized as Palestinians in any way. So we are US tourists. We have no right to, certainly, Israeli citizenship, and there's no such thing, as far as the Israeli government is concerned, as Palestinian nationality, even though there very clearly is. So, I mean, that might give an idea of, I mean, these communities, imagine Italian Americans, Irish Americans, all the people we spent 20 years living amongst in the United States, they can all visit, they can all talk about their grandparents and their ancestors and the villages they came from. There's no tension there. It's just a diaspora. This is an exile.